Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on Saturday, June 5th, for another session on Sadiq International Virtual Universities series on medical education. Today we have the great pleasure of having hosting our global faculty. We have Dr. Siraj Ali Mohammed, who will be presenting on building and sustaining online communities of inquiry in HPE. So I welcome you and thank you so much for being here. We also have the great pleasure of the event being moderated by Dr. Sucheta Dandekar. She has a PhD in biochemistry, MHPE from Keele University, and is a professor of biochemistry at ERA Lucknow Medical College. She's an adjunct faculty at the Manipal Academy of Health Education and global faculty at FAMER in Philadelphia. So welcome and thank you so much, Dr. Sujeta and Dr. Siraj, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shifa and Cebu University for allowing me the pleasure of moderating this session. With your permission, Dr. Zaidi and Shifa, we will begin with the proceedings. And I have the pleasant task of introducing my dear friend, Dr. Siraj Ali Mohammed. Dr. Mohammed is the Deputy Director of the Center for Continuing Education and Interprofessional Development and Professor of Microbiology at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, a Fellow and Global Faculty of FAMER, Philadelphia. He is the recipient of the American Society of Microbiology and Honorable Mention Award, UNESCO Award for International Educators, and Outstanding Mentor Award. Dr. Siraj is a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Department of Molecular Biology and Infectious Diseases, Florida International University. Siraj completed his master's in health professions education, specializing in assessment and accreditation from Keele University, UK, with a distinction. He has authored articles and chapters in medical education and medical microbiology and served on the editorial board of many journals. For the innovative student-centered pedagogic approaches in medical education, he was awarded the Best Teacher Award 8 times by his university. He's the founder director of the fellowship program that focuses on leadership in international professional education, organized in collaboration with FAMER. He is currently the chair of INDIPEN, the Indian Interprofessional Education Network, and also a member of the Global Confederation for Interprofessional Education and Collaborative Practice, which he coordinates as a working group on academic and workforce development. Dr. Siraj is the National Secretary of the Indian Academy of Health Professions Education and also serves on the advisory board of the Network Towards the Unity for Health, Philadelphia. So you can see Siraj wears a number of hats and very efficiently so. I welcome you all to this webinar on building and sustaining online communities of inquiry in health professions education. And this is the need of the hour because community of inquiry in health profession education focuses on a reflective paradigm and fosters union of like-minded people who will engage in meaningful inquiry. So this session will discuss diverse approaches to ensure social, cognitive, and teaching presence using an established framework to design and facilitate successful educational experiences in online learning environments. So with this small brief, over to you, Dr. Siraj Ali Mohammed. The stage is all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Sucheta, Shifa, and Dr. Saidi for inviting me to this prestigious gathering. And I hope I'm audible and my slides are visible. Just checking once again before I start the session.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you, Sucheta. So today's session focuses on how one could build and sustain communities of inquiry. And there are two elements that we have attached to communities of inquiry as they are important in my professional sphere. And I understand that many of you who have joined here belong to the same domain. One aspect is it is related to health professions education. Not exclusively, though, because there have been studies on communities of inquiry much before in many other fields too. The second aspect that we try to actually hinge along with communities of inquiry is the online format. If this session was hosted 2 years back, roughly a little, you know, uh, of this duration, I'm sure that I would not have been in a position to talk to you about the prefix online communities. I would have rather spoken only about communities of inquiry and communities of practice associated with health professions education. But the pandemic, which forced us do many things that we did not like to do, or which, of course, we thought many of us considered totally sacrilegious, especially in the field of medicine and health professional education, today is a norm. No one would have ever thought that medicine would have ever been delivered online, at least some portions, I would say. And if anyone started talking about it, I'm very sure that they would have been deemed not fit to be in this professional sphere. So, having said that, as I mentioned to you, today's session will try to see how, as health professions educators, we could build and, of course, sustain. Pandemic is likely to go away, but the online presence that you and me have created as educators will stay for long. And I'm sure that many of those important aspects, which are beneficial both for the students and teachers, are likely to stay. But how do we actually encourage, how do we foster, how do we facilitate online communities of inquiry? Now, having said that, one should always look to what exactly it means by online communities. So, my session today, for another 40-45 minutes or so, will focus on what exactly are online communities of inquiry and why do we need them? Is it just in the context of the remote teaching that is happening, or the pandemic that emerged, or is it something that needs to be curated, preserved for the future? And we will also see, as educators, how do we actually design or develop these communities of inquiry? So that's how the land lies ahead. Here is a brief introduction of learning communities, especially in the context of inquiry or communities of inquiry. We often know that when we have to call someone community, or some a group of people as communities, they must have goals that people share, and often they are cited as common goals. Now, in a learning arena, specifically in the context of online learning in health professions education, these are just not common goals. These are integral not only to the implementation of the curriculum, not only to the outcomes that you and me actually look as teachers in health professions education, these are shared goals that we actually cherish with every stakeholder, from student to the patient. So that makes a communities of inquiry very special in the context of health professions education. As it is often mentioned, these are aspirational, these goals are aspirational. But many a times, we see that attached to the vision and mission, aspirational goals, but may not be real. So here, communities of inquiry, especially in the context of online learning, put forward puts forward very pragmatic, though they may look idealistic, pragmatic goals that must be achieved within the domain of what you and me preach and teach. Now, we have heard about doctors sans borders, engineers sans borders, but people who are involved with this, the teachers actually who are involved with this, I call them actors without borders. Because if you want to cherish a community of practice, if you want to cherish communities of inquiry, they must be, beyond disciplines, beyond borders, encouraging multidisciplinary, encouraging interprofessional activities. Having said that, whatever you do, integrity and transparency is a must. And hence, as for any quality assurance schemes, accountability is the key in a community of inquiry. I will also emphasize with the experiences that I have garnered about a very important form of leadership that is essential for implementing or for building and for sustaining communities of inquiry. That is distributed leadership. That's in a way. With that introduction, I would just prefer introducing the framework to you of communities of inquiry or community of inquiry. Now, some of you are familiar. For some, this may be a new concept. One of the most widely used frameworks for building communities online is the Community of Inquiry framework. And this was developed by Garrison and Anderson in 2000. So we are actually going to use this framework as lens and trying to see how we could, you know, in the current situation and of course in the days to come, how do we actually use this for as an instructional framework? Way before Garrison and Anderson proposed it, I'm sure that some of you who would have taken education seriously are aware about the work of John Dewey, practical inquiry. It is based on the same practical inquiry this framework was developed. So inquiry looks more into the knowledge aspects, and of course in terms of knowledge development and creation. So do we strongly believe that individual development is dependent on community? A community which is community is something that we use very frequently and very loosely among educators. But what we are going to talk about here, community, is the connections that we make, the cognitive connections, the emotional connections that we actually establish specifically in this context among learners who are physically separated, because we are talking about online communities. So as being a member of a community, one must have that strong sense of feelings of a community. And this is vital because in order to ensure the flow of information, in order to request for support, in order to commit to the group goals, in order to cooperate among group members, and also to develop satisfaction, this is essential. Now, without much delay, let me go into the framework. As you see in this picture of the framework, there are three elements that you see. There is the social presence, the cognitive presence, and the teaching presence. And that encompasses the whole educational experiences, that you want to provide. This is trying to put it a little more, clear in terms of the three important core elements. As you can see there, towards the right, cognitive presence, and then social presence, and then teaching presence. Now, these three core elements are used to create a meaningful educational experiences. And as you see in this picture, or as you see in this framework that has been put here, they are interdependent. So what does this framework assume? it assumes that effective online learning, particularly of the higher order, which characterizes, health professions education, is dependent on the development of a community, right? So there has been large number of additions made into this, which I'm not going to discuss because that is not the aim of this talk. But as you see here, when it comes to social presence, there must be engagement with the participants, and primarily our students and the people involved. And there must be an educational climate set for these educational experiences which supports discourse. Now, cognitive presence also includes many other things, that is the regulated learning aspects, interactions, and then comes the teaching presence. You can see that these are all interdependent, and it is difficult to actually separate them out and say that this one is responsible for this. Now, I will take you through these three different phases: social, cognitive, and teaching, and try to see how these are relevant in the context of the learning that we are talking about. For cognitive presence, I will use a model known as the practice inquiry model that is again created by Garrison, and you can see that here. You can see that the PIM, practice inquiry model, hereafter will be mentioned as PIM. This model has four phases. The first phase is the triggering event. Now, triggering event happens in the shared world. This is not something that is exclusively for the learner or for the teacher. It's in the shared world. And this is where a problem is identified for further inquiry. Now, in the context of health professions education, it could be a clinical problem. It could be a lab values related to a disease. It could be social issues associated with a disease. So this is the triggering event. Then comes, of course, here is the experiences. That's a combination of perception and conception that we have written here. But let's move on to the next event. Next is in the world, in the online world or in the world of the learner, exploration, where an individual is exploring the issue. So this is followed by integration. This is practice inquiry model. So in integration, where the learners basically, where learners concept meaning from the ideas that are formed in the exploration phase. So they're going to actually build in those things as they explore, as they find that the reasons for this specific symptom is perhaps because of these things that I've learned, in my previous years, or it could be because of these things that have happened, in relation to this particular patient. So that is integration, and this is followed by the most important aspect of resolution, as we say. So in resolution, that what happens is students can apply this knowledge and skills learned from the previous phases into real world application. So if you look at this particular aspect, uh, it's just not a triggering event. Many of us would have experienced this in different ways, though it has been put as a model and put here. Triggering event, exploration, integration, and resolution in practice. Now, just to break the monotony, I would like people to, I hope they can write in the chat box, what are the other things that you think are integral to this model? We have mentioned about specific events. So what are the other things that, as I believe that most of you here are educators, even so can we just have your comments on that? What are the other things that, and Sujata may read out this for me, right, Sujata?
Yeah, sure.
So my question is, if you look at practice, or this the model, practical inquiry model, often mentioned as practical inquiry model, what do you think in this model, inherent to this model, are other aspects that can actually, you think influence this model as teachers, or as professors, or as clinicians, or as medical educators? Azan Saidi writes, very good actors without borders. Thank you for that compliment. I mean, that was for the previous one, but this question is basically on I hope we have a framework of interacting with participants. If we don't have, I think I will proceed with my. Okay,
You know,
Hamid.
we
Yeah.
have Hamid Reza who mentions facilitator.
Okay. Excellent.
Saida
So
Ali is talking about context and critical analysis, which are
okay.
important. Dr. Zaidi says, Azan Zaidi talks about aspirations.
Okay. Before let this keep coming, but let me talk about the three important things that have come up. I will start with aspirations. Motivations are extremely important for people to be there, right? So that actually, guides, or that is going to be a very important factor. And as long as it's internal motivation, it will be better. Then comes context and critical analysis. I would not agree more than Saida. It's extremely important to look at the context, because in education, specifically in health profession education, everything is dependent on context. So then comes facilitator. Yes, as a role, a teacher's role is largely for facilitation. Yeah, I can see Zabir saying about gathering and assimilating previous knowledge. Yes, this is for an educator who often talk about the schema. There is a cognitive presence here, or that there is an element of cognition gathered from previous knowledge, which are arranged in the form of, the schema. And as and when you want, you retrieve. This is an educator's favorite area. Critical evaluation,
Critical
Azan.
evaluation.
Yes. So I have a question to Azan, that if you have to do a critical evaluation, oh, there it comes. I was waiting for this.
Reflection.
Yeah, yeah.
Margaret
Margaret,
says reflection.
thank you, Margaret, for that. I was actually guiding the whole discussion towards, because uh, having said about most of these things, actually speaking, the most important, the key aspect of the framework that I discussed is reflection. Because whether it is to increase their cognitive presence, or you need reflection on the learning content, you need to reflect on the outcomes, you need to reflect on how I have learned, why I have learned, and what skills that I have gathered, and how am I going to use this. So that is good, Margaret, and Hazan and Sabir, and all those, Hamid, I think, Shifa, and people who have
Saida.
actually, yeah. Thank you for that. I think, shall I go ahead, Sujata?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So let me just go to the next one. That is, this was about the cognitive. Now comes the social presence. The social presence is equally, sometimes I would say, in the current context of the pandemic, is more important than the cognitive presence, because here is where we actually look at the ability of our learners to identify with the community. Identify with the community means the learning community. We are talking about the learning community. So just making ourselves feel, look, we are the real people actually in this particular community, and so there is an element of communicating purposefully in a trusting environment. Let me re-emphasize this. Purposefully means, that online learning has been heavily criticized for some of those trivial matters that have been given, center stage. So if assessment is inbuilt into the whole, element of the education that you're trying to do, even online, you are looking for a social presence where a communication is purposeful. And if that purposeful communication has to come based on the outcomes that you have, do not expect a learner to give that fully unless he or she will be trusting the environment that you have built up. That means there is a need to have very good relationships, interpersonal relationships, and in a way, projecting the individual personalities. May sound, little difficult, but this is what people would have experienced over the last 1 year or more than that, that unless and until you touch this aspect, you fail to actually get the social presence of your learners. And if you don't have this social presence, you can never, ever develop communities of inquiry, because this is an extremely important. That's why I said most important than the teaching presence and the social presence. Now, there are three important elements to it. The first one is the emotional expression, where learners share their personal experiences, personal expressions, personal values. And I'm sure you will appreciate that it will happen only if you have trust in the system that you are. Then comes the open communication. The open communication is basically about mutual awareness and recognition that people have in their group. And finally, group cohesion. And these have been all largely based on the work that I quoted earlier, Garrison, Anderson, and Richardson and Swan, who actually conducted studies on the group cohesion. In group cohesion, basically, you look how learners can build up and sustain a sense of group commitment. That is the topic that we're discussing today. So again, there is a renewed interest that has surfaced, specifically in the area of health professional education, because these were all not much discussed, and the pandemic has forced us to do this. So that was social presence. Then comes teaching presence. Now, teaching presence is how do you basically design your teaching? How do you actually direct your teaching, of all that cognitive, all the social processes that we mentioned earlier to support learning? How do we do that? Now, this is, how do we actually create meaningful and worthwhile learning outcomes? This is basically very interesting for educators, as it is very closely linked to setting up the curriculum, setting out designing the methods. So that is instructional design and organization. And how do we actually set that educational climate? Most of us often keep talking about the safe learning environment, but in the online domain, students actually, you really don't know whether they are feeling safe or whether they are feeling unsafe. So facilitating discourse is a very important aspect of it. That means you acknowledge and reinforce the student contributions and things like that. Then comes the direct instruction. Now, that is where you will present your information, you will ask questions, you will summarize. So teaching presence has three important components. So this is what we mentioned about the three elements that make up the framework. Now, this is in a nutshell how what I was mentioning. That's about the social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence, and the categories that we must be looking at, and the indicators, associated indicators. So giving a little more additional features to it, we were talking about the communities of inquiry framework. We talked about three important aspects that have to come into it. And then, of course, the elements that make up the intersection. And of course, as a whole, how it actually creates, an environment that is conducive for in a educational context. So now let's see the next aspect of that means how do we actually get into this framework. And I will use one of my favorite I would say work, or rather it is more, it's not a framework, the principles, and of course I would request if someone can identify, Sujata, not you, but
No, I won't.
yeah, this seminal piece that I often, I make a point to read this every year before the start of an academic year, because that gives me not only the direction but also inspiration. Can someone here tell me, based on what I have focused, which is this work, or which article, or at least the name of the people who actually are behind these 7 principles, which actually make up in relation to undergraduate education? So let's see, Sujata, if somebody is aware about it.
Yes, sure.
They can just type it. What are these 7 principles? Okay, I already mentioned these 7 principles are for good practice for undergraduate education, but is anyone familiar with the people who worked with it? It's a seminal piece in education. Do we have someone who has written, Sujata?
No, not as yet. I think you can go ahead and
okay, never mind, it's fine. This is the work of Schickering and Gamson, who actually identifies the most important principles, especially in the context of undergraduate education. the seven principles: encouraging contact between students and faculty, developing reciprocity and cooperation among students, encouraging active learning, giving feedback, emphasizing time on task, communicating high expectations, and respecting diverse talents. Now, uh, a few months before, when we actually started looking into this, we thought that, I mean, when I say this, that I meant communities of online, online communities of inquiry or communities of online inquiry. Uh, we didn't know that there has already been work happening in this direction. And that is where we came across. This is, of course, Chickering and Gamson's seven principles of good practice for undergraduate education. We realized that in 2009 only, Sorensen and Balin had actually, formatted this, or rather, used this in the context of online education. So in this, they make modifications. They decided that these seven principles uh, were, could be utilized to see that how it can be tweaked to address online learning environments. So in the next few minutes, what I'm going to do is the how aspects of it. When you talk about communities of inquiry, how do we actually using these seven principles? And these are very practical suggestions. There is absolutely no theoretical. There is theoretical understanding though, but are based on, there are theoretical underpinnings, but these are practical aspects that as educators we will be able to take up one by one. So let's begin with the first one, that is encouraging student teacher contact. We are talking about online presence, we are talking about online communities of inquiry, and we should also be aware about the framework. So it has three elements: the cognitive, the social, and of course, the one teaching presence. So in cognitive, if you take up the first aspect as far as the principles are concerned, the best way, there are so many ways that one could do, but for this particular talk I have taken the ones that have appealed me and the ones that I have used in practice. So so that is something that with confidence I can tell you that it brings this cognitive or social or teaching presence. So in cognitive aspects, it is the scaffolding that has to be, scaffolding, about cognitive scaffolding, to what extent sometimes you will have to help your learners to understand those topics that you're covering online. So that may be essential, and this is a part of encouraging student teacher contact. What are those activities that you will have in this particular category, encouraging student teacher contact, for enhancing your social presence? One of the very commonly done exercises is an activity known as meet your class, and this is an online event. You actually will get an opportunity, and I think this is very important, especially when you are starting a new year, or some students who have enrolled into new batches. Meet your class, and then comes dedicated course introductions. People talk about what exactly these courses are meant for. We all lived in educational situations, arenas, and environments where it was possible for the student, and you had the physical contact, or the face to face opportunities where you could actually introduce this. You could see if somebody had some doubts, or even if you look at students, you understand, if you are someone as a teacher, you have experience, that there is something that is actually brewing there, and could ask for it. But these things are not possible. And if you want to create a social presence, you must do dedicated course introductions. Look, this is the course. These are your course faculty. These are the people who will run this course. Now, this is what will be done in the course. These are the modalities. These are the teaching learning methods. So this will enhance social presence and encourage student teacher contact. Then comes the teaching presence. Teaching presence is simply by showing that you are there, not as a hovering, teacher, and trying to intimidate or trying to get into everything that the students, are going to post online or to present online. But rather, showing that you are there, and
So I think we've just lost connection to Dr.
Yes.
Siraj momentarily, but I'm sure he'll be back in a few moments.
I'll also let him know that
In the meanwhile, if we can please, since we have everyone here, if we can please have you introduce yourselves. We have about 70 of you here. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We would love to hear where you're coming from, and if you are faculty, where you reside and where you're working. So it's just momentarily, we're just getting Dr. Siraj back. But please introduce yourselves as part of this online learning community. We would love to hear from you. Hello, Dr. Tathir from Islamabad, Pakistan. Welcome. Dr. Madad Ali and Sayyida Qasir Ali from Karachi, Pakistan. Welcome. Dr. Ehsan Zaidi from the UK has joined us as well. And Margaret is from UAE. Dr. Madad Ali is from Fatma University in New Jersey. Dr. Anuja, welcome. And Dr. Hamid Reza, consultant in Mashhad University of Medical Sciences, Mashhad, Iran. And we have Dr. Siraj, who has joined us back. Hello, Dr. Siraj.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry, suddenly something happened.
No, no worries. We just, in the spirit of the online community, we asked everyone to introduce themselves in the chat. So it's very nice to see everyone from so many different countries joining us today.
I don't know from where we got de-linked.
It's all right here. I'll ask you to share your slides, and I think it's.
yeah, we can tell you.
I hope we haven't missed very much.
Okay, so I remember we started with Shikering and Gams.
Share your slides. Huh? Share the slide.
Yeah, I'm doing it. 1 second.
Welcome, Dr. Ayman, Head of Medical Education Department from Libya, Famer Fellow 2020. Welcome. Thank you so much.
I'm in Bukhara. I know him.
Mashallah. Yes.
It came?
Yes.
Yes.
If you can put it on slideshow.
So I think I was discussing about this particular aspect.
You already finished about 2 points.
Yeah.
Meet your class and show your presence. You were just beginning with.
I was talking about teaching presence, right? Yeah.
Teaching
show your
presence,
presence.
yes.
Yeah. I was mentioning that do not be like a hovering parent. Be,
Yes,
but you are there, right? You connect with them frequently. They can actually, connect with you. So let's go to the next one: developing cooperation among students. Now, this is very simple in terms of cognitive one. That means we must be asking open-ended questions, provocative open-ended questions. Well, not that simple when it comes to, if you really want to get them involved. If you are somebody who has been teaching for the last few months during online, you will see that many a times you may not get the response that you actually had, received, especially in the face-to-face, because students, for that, you may have to ensure this by your social presence. So it may sound silly, trivial, but we have seen that having icebreakers in between and getting connected with them, that makes a lot of difference. And how do you ensure your teaching presence? Now, you must be familiar with the collaborative learning principles. The same holds good if you really want your teaching presence and develop cooperation among students. It is important by ensuring this climate. Many of us are very familiar with active learning, but how do you do that in the online mode, especially in the context of the framework that we are talking? Again, let's go through the 3 important elements of it. Cognitive element. You must allow the student to actually uh, visualize himself of his ideas or her ideas. That means the students do not have any hesitation sharing with you their ideas. So you're seeing students as, I will say, students as developers. Then comes the social presence. How do you ensure social presence? That is where you actually ask them to lead the group discussions in the group. And I call this as students as experts. Teaching presence is, you must also provide them with enough opportunities for problem solving. Here, students or learners as strategists. So for promoting active learning, you will have to see all these three phases using different ways you can accomplish this. As I told you, I'm just sharing those ways that I actually have tried and found it useful. In your own context, you may be having the different ways of doing this. We will move on to the next one. Very important in the context of health professional education. You always have a poverty of practice. Everyone talks about feedback, but the complaint is that hardly anyone practices real feedback. So providing effective feedback. Now, how do we do that in the cognitive element? There must be peer review of the discussion posting. So if you have ensured discussion postings, you ask students from the same group to discuss, actually, peer review of that. It can be a written one, it can be uploaded, it can be on the LMS, but a peer review. And we have seen this very useful, because when students start actually critically appraising the work written by their peers, there is a lot of learning that happens. Social presence. You can have an audio or video feedback on the assignments. And again, experiences show that students are very keen to know about what they have provided. Now, this timely, it's a very important aspect, whether it is in online or offline. It has to be timely feedback, supportive, especially during the time of pandemic, and when there is a lot of apprehensions. It is very important that your feedback is supportive, and often it has to be personalized rather than simply saying that this was a great job done by X, Y, or whatever it is. You may have to actually look at what are those important aspects that need to be taken into consideration as far as progression is concerned, as far as improvement is concerned, as far as the fundamental elements and their acquisition of the concepts are concerned. At the same time, use it also for reinforcing good practices. Then comes emphasizing time on task. Now, we cannot say that, look, these are difficult times, so let's not have a time frame for it, right? We won't do that, because it's very important for us that uh, it is very important in the three important phases, I would say. For example, cognitive phase. Now, you probably should encourage activities that are basically suiting towards skill development and convergent thinking. Now, this is very difficult in an online setting. The task that you're going to emphasize, that no, that is where people have started using simulations. Simulations, and also asking learners to get involved in some sort of self reviews, and making them into groups and do interactive interactive aspects. Now, how do we make the social presence here, emphasizing time on task? Now, you will have to provide online orientation, as I told you earlier in this course, and people have started making video walkthroughs to the entire the course, what it actually is in store for them, and things like that. Now, teaching presence, how do you ensure this? You have to map out all the course requirements in advance, and we are all experts in this. We would have actually listed this out, but it's also important as a part of online communities of inquiry. And of course, then comes, how do we actually communicate high expectations? Now, in the cognitive phase or cognitive domain, or related to the framework that I'm talking, there should be an opportunity basically to talk about the big ideas or the ideas that could become big in the context of what your learner has provided. And that's a lot of stimulation that is, students get. Now, in the social areas, you must emphasize on the nature and potential of online learning. Now, there is a lot of apprehensions people have, though slowly it is going away. No one would have ever thought that we will be actually preparing doctors of tomorrow, uh, at least to some extent through online mode. So these are met with. At the same time, we must communicate expectations that it holds potential. It has its own benefits. Uh, and when it comes to teaching presence, here is something you cannot beat around the bush. You got to be very explicit. You have to be very specific with the instructions that you make, especially in the context of the expectations that you are communicating. Finally, respecting diverse ways of learning. Now, here is where we will have to strive and see that people who have diverse ways of learning are addressed. Now, in cognitive, it is simply done by having multiple activities that address different types of learners, and multiple representations. So some would prefer a team-based format, some would prefer a simulation, some would prefer a game-based format, some would probably use a narrative storytelling and so on. While you're doing that, it's also important to establish the rules of netiquette for your course, because that is a social presence that you're going to make as a teacher, as an instructor, and designing of appropriate learning experiences. That is the teaching aspect that you will look into. So that is how we have tried to see that how you create an online communities of inquiry based on Chickering and Gamson's principles, 7 principles. Now, as we come to an end of this session, I just wanted to tell you that when you are creating an online communities of inquiry, you must be thoughtful about the needs of your learner, and it starts from there. And you just cannot presume that this is best for my learner, and it is very important to address these. Then comes building the right environment, which we were talking about, the educational environment. Now, writing or stating policing the community might look a little bit awkward, but it is important to often monitor what's happening in these online communities, because there may be early interventions that may be essential to get everyone on board, number one. Number two, there may be one or two people who can disrupt the entire efforts that you put in. So you must be aware about this. You cannot say that it's an online thing, and if they want to learn, let them learn. No, the whole idea is actually to see that they get benefit maximally, and an online community is actually built up. So as it happens anywhere else, there could be people who could uh, jeopardize the efforts that you put in creating and developing this community. Now, equally important is the last aspect that I'm mentioning, and we are doing that now, is to see that how do we convert many of these activities that happen in these online learning communities to learning resources, because these things can be actually going to your repositories, reducing the time that you'll have to invest in the future years to come. So these things must be kept in mind. And finally, going to the last aspect, we saw what is an online communities of inquiry. We saw the framework. We have seen the 3 important components of this framework, that is the teaching presence, the cognitive presence, and the social presence. I used the 7 principles of Chickering and Gamson, and then also Sorensen and Balin's framework, to see that how do you actually bring in activities. Just gave you an idea of what that some of us do in real practice. And finally, moving on to the significance of online community. Now, as you see there, teaching and learning have left the classrooms, sadly. Now, teaching can leave the classroom, but learning must be still there. That is where the online communities have a role to play. When we say it is a physical classroom setting that we are talking about. So it has made it I would say mandatory now to have such online learning communities. And when you are doing this, it's very important to address connecting people as a competency. We know that there are so many competencies, and we live in an era of competency frameworks and competency-based medical education. But if you were to develop online learning communities or communities of inquiry, the ability to connect with people and to sustain these relations must be considered as a competency. Along with that comes, the creativity, connectivity, collisions. Now, when you are setting goals in this, it's here chance favors the connected ones. People who are well connected, people who have formed networks, people who have, communities of inquiry, which might become communities of practice in due course, are the most who are benefited. Now, we also talked about the shared learning that happens, and that is where some of us at Manipal specialize in. We are actually the pioneers of interprofessional education and practice in the Indian context. So what we do is we try to bring learners from diverse professions together and ask them to learn from, with, and about each other. And of course, we also have a fellowship that runs for 2 years for educators, the FAMER fellowship that we have. And it is in this context that I wanted to discuss one of the integral element that is a must in developing such communities, that is the distributed leadership. So distributed leadership basically empowers people to the core. This is something that will trust you as an important partner in the whole process and will empower you so that you meet not only the needs of the community, but of course, you will also see that you establish synergy in the environment so that people, benefit from each other's interactions. Now, there is also a climate that is extremely ethical and a culture that is democratical. So it is just not delegation of your work, because it should not be misunderstood that people can just delegate and that becomes a part of distributed leadership. It is just a learning organization in the making. So you will see that every aspects done are in the benefit of the people who are involved. Now, this by itself is a separate topic that we could discuss for a session, but I just wanted to tell you that these things are not achieved overnight. There are cultural and epistemological barriers that are going to surface. As I told you, if someone had told us 3 years back that you can study medicine online, I'm sure that we would not have allowed that person sitting inside the department. You would have chased him off, right? So there are multiple barriers that needs to be addressed, and this should be borne in mind. And finally, I just wanted to tell you that when you are creating, values, we will see that there are different ways that people look at it. Some of those things which are very immediate means I am a part of this community, so that I got the learning resources for my class or for my clinics or whatever it is. That's an immediate value. Potential value is that I find value which can come later, as a partner, as a person in this community. Then comes the values of application, realized values, and reframing values. There are different values at which these aspects operate when it comes to communities of inquiry. And with that, I think the time has come for me to wind up this session. And I will put this famous old story that most of us are very familiar with in the context of communities of inquiry. Had there been communities of inquiry, it was very sure that they would have made sense of the elephant. But being in silos, being in isolation, they just found meaning to only what they perceived or what they felt or what they actually thought about. So with that, I would like to conclude and would like to take questions, if any. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siraj, for that excellent thought-provoking webinar. Dr. Suleiman has mentioned Wegner's community of practice, and also when you spoke to us, you mentioned the community of practice. So he wants to know how the community of practice by Wegner and the community of inquiry can be merged, so to say.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, 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 we can hear you.
Yeah, I didn't get that question. Could you please repeat that question?
Dr. Suleiman mentions Wegner's community of practice, and he wants to know how have you considered the Wegner's community of practice when you mentioned the community of inquiry? Is it both are intertwined in each other, or what is it?
Okay, I think I hope you mentioned also. I think that I did make a mention of communities of
Yes,
practice,
you do.
though
You
though
did mention. So
yeah, yeah,
I think we would like you to elaborate on that.
yeah.
Yes.
Though I did
Thank you.
not mention Wegener's. See, there
Yes.
are different types of communities. When you look at, so Wegener's communities of practice are basically the highest level of it. A group of people who share concern or have passion for something they do, and they'll do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. Now, I did mention this in the context of communities of inquiry. I was mentioning that we would like these also to come to that level, but it's not that easy because you're dealing with learners. You're dealing with learners, you're dealing with students. But I agree with you that if they must come to that level of community of practice where people have a passion of doing something, but this is generally a change among professionals. But that should not be
Hmm.
an excuse. And it's thank you, Sulaiman, for actually having brought this up. I did mention, though I didn't mention the names, but you would like to see that emerging as communities of practice in the long run.
We any more questions? We have, please put them in the chat box, or you could raise your hand. If not, I have one question. What about empathy and attitude? How would we actually be able to uh, demonstrate it in the case of online learning?
Yeah, demonstration, of course. But if you look at the framework, there is
Yes.
a very important aspect of social presence.
Hmm.
That
Yes.
is where, as educators, we will have to, demonstrate in the
Hmm.
social presence activity, the provision for empathy that you have. Now,
Hmm.
when it comes to the learner, because if you look at empathy, it is the act of perceiving, understanding, and responding to the emotional state and ideas of another person. So, in the context of communities of inquiry,
Hmm.
I have actually given a list of those activities where it is very important to show this concern, especially to the learner who is online.
Yeah. That will be a very important aspect that we'll have to keep in mind. Uh, so thank you for that, Dr. Siraj. We have Margaret who says, what about emotional intelligence and understanding how you respond to others?
Yeah, this
And
is
we
a
have Dr.
very
Zaidi with his, who would also like to ask a question after you've answered Margaret.
yeah, Margaret, this is a very important aspect. But if you look at emotional, intelligence, you have the most important aspects of self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy that Sucheta just now mentioned, social skills. Now, all these things are embedded into the framework. So it is important that these things are there. How you respond to others. Now, I would say that the onus is more on educators. You can't actually put the whole thing on these learners and say they are expected to be empathy, showing empathy. They are expected to, that is where the whole framework heavily relies on the teacher to see that how this framework can be implemented. So I agree with you, there are elements of empathy, I mean emotional intelligence, though we have not specifically used those terminologies, whether it is Wegner's communities of practice or Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence, but these are all inherent. I just kept it at the level of a basic educator who must bring in the elements of self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and everything into it. Because, and then of course we can play around with the jargons that we have. But this is a very, very basic understanding of how, because I must admit and confess, like many medical educators, we are in the very formative stages as far as online education is concerned. Unfortunately, medical education and medical educators are people who, blow their trumpet often very loud, even without understanding the basic tenets of education. And it's unfortunate because, there is so much to learn in these aspects. And I would say that we are, and at least when you consider me, it's a very formative phase that we are. And, especially the social aspects of this has never been
Yes.
probed. It is just because people believe on certain reports, we go by, and these are very contextual. You need to actually understand what is happening in the minds of the learners, and that will differ from Africa to Asia to Europe to America. And this has to be actually evaluated as educators. Suleiman has another question. Can you read out that?
Yes, yes, I can
I
read
hope,
that out.
Margaret, I have addressed your
I
query.
think Dr. Zaidi, before that, Dr. Zaidi had his hand up. So if you
Yeah.
could, Dr. Zaidi, would you like to say something?
Yes, first of all, congratulations. It's a great honor to listen to you. It's wonderful, so educational, so powerful. So compliments, sir. And also a request that please come back and give us another lecture on the topic that you mentioned. Now, I'd like to just add one thing. We talked about ethical in context with the discussion about the ethical aspects and how do you measure it. The problem is that the word that we're using constantly in the educational field of attitude is not acceptable to ethicists. They would prefer to call it behavior. And when you talk of behavior, behavior is visible, perceptible, and observable. Therefore, if you're talking about ethical aspects in distance learning, certain elements are difficult to assess, but because ethics is a part of behavior, which is embedded in culture, you can observe certain activities, like how does one, like the old-fashioned bedside teaching and things. So it is not difficult to assess. The question is, we're still struggling in the fields of ethics to define the measures, the targets, the objectives, and the definition of the parameters as to how to use it. Now, this is the reason I say is because in the Encyclopedia of Islamic Medical Ethics that I wanted to contribute is one whole chapter mentioned about the role of ethics in education. And this way we come to the question, and this question is to the panelists. How do you measure? Are there any parameters that you can tell us to measure ethics behavior in the educational activities, particularly in distant learning? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm in 100% unison with you. But when I said ethics, I actually was referring to the ethical climate actually as a part of organization, not so much as the learners aspects. That is, I 100% I agree with you, that is the behavior. But I was referring to the ethical climate because if we do not have an ethical climate prevailing, distributed leadership will not happen. Because an ethical climate, it will be caring, at the same time it's going to actually help people encourage make decision according to personal moral and beliefs. And that is what I was trying to emphasize in terms of ethical climate. How do we actually encourage this in terms of distributed leadership? But I entirely agree with you that it is the behavioral aspects that should be looked upon when it comes to the student.
So true, so true. Well said. And thank you, Dr. Zaidi, for that thought-provoking question. We have Dr. Bedi, who asks, what are the strategies if some community of practice becomes inactive?
Okay. It often happens. It's not very easy to, and I'm very sure that if this Bedi is same as our Sanjay Bedi.
Yes, yes, Sanjay.
So Sanjay, you should be answering this question for me. So after having started so many online communities, I'm sure that you got fed up
So
with some
true.
of them and you're asking this to me. Yeah, but anyhow, that was on a lighter side. If you look at Sanjay, if you want to actually encourage, sustain online community engagements, I would say that some of the time-tested strategies is one, of course, is identify and encourage champions. You know that some of these people are excellent, and you need to identify them and encourage. Now, you must also organize communities around I would say, topics where interests and roles of people are made very clear. Unfortunately, these days you see that people want to make communities that I will again that links to Dr. Suleiman's question of making deliberately a community, and that no, it doesn't work like that, because you have actually identified your learning outcomes. You have identified and created a community based not only on the roles but on mutual interest. So it is very important to have them actually created and developed so that there is relevant engagement opportunities. If there is no relevant engagement opportunities, I'm afraid that these kind of communities will not be sustained. I would also suggest one more important strategy. It is very important to connect other programs, I would say, to your online community. For example, as you build up, we must slowly see that how like-minded even like-minded people who actually do events or who are a part of research are linked to this. So that means the people who are in this community do not actually feel like segmented departments. Though there is a mutual understanding of what we all share, what we all love to do, there should be some point where they can be connected with other programs. So I would say identifying and encouraging champions, that is one way of actually sustaining your online community. And then of course also creating communities based on interests, and that get them engaged in a very relevant manner, and also spread out your communities to the related events, related research, related activities, so that people can identify ways and means to sustain the activities.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Siraj, for that guidance on how to keep the online community going. In fact, Shehnaz from Iran has asked a question about the threats to the online community, learning community.
What was that? Threats. Okay,
The threats to the
yeah.
online.
Yeah, Shahnaz, this is a very important
Yeah.
question.
Yes.
You see, I just put one slide, if you remember, because though it's one of my favorite areas, it's because of time factors. Now, the barriers, if you see, many of these are by itself, they have come up because they are threats, and that are classified into multiple aspects. Some of these are cultural threats, when it comes to building up of online communities, and that is very contextual. These threats that emerge and some are epistemological, that is the knowledge of those things. For example, we never thought that you will be using games, for example, for promoting engagement among students. So the belief is that if you're going to have games, look, then you don't have this entire community of learners. You're risking, there's a possibility of people getting detached with you, or they're going to not getting engaged with whatever you want. That is a perceived risk. It may not be true also. Then comes the risks that people have in terms of the excess time that is going to be invested. So people have a feeling that when you have this, it's going to take a lot of my time, and this is not going to be beneficial in long run. So online learning communities, one of course is the cultural aspects that I have mentioned about you. Then comes the epistemological, then comes the professional threats by itself. So it could be ranging from so getting into even losing or risking one's own professional identity as a part of this. So along with that, you must read other aspects which are normally mentioned about, that is the time issues, the time constraints that can come, the health issues that can be read along with this. So these are the threads that, but these are generic ones, and I'm sure that you understand this.
Yeah. Thank you, Siraj. One more aspect that comes to my mind is what is in it for me? That kind of a question also may arise. Do you agree with me?
Yeah, that is true. In terms of a community, maybe it can be there,
Yes.
you know, but that's more of, it becomes difficult to sustain uh,
Hmm.
when you have someone, and I would say sometimes unrealistic expectations are a threat, uh,
Yes, yes.
and
Uh,
that way there are multiple ones. If you look at that resourcing,
Correct.
for
And that
example.
is the reason why, I feel what you mentioned in about having that a separate chat session or an informal session, which sort of
Yeah,
binds the community, the online
yeah,
participants also
yeah.
together. That is so important. What I've been always saying at ERAs, we should have a chai pe charcha sessions, or which will help
No, because
it all.
if you ask me, I didn't want to mention that here because that it's the number one risk. The number one risk for a flourishing online community is the inadequate resourcing. You know,
Yes.
and that is where leadership comes into picture. So if you ask, I think it was somebody from Iran, Shahnaz, I think, asked about the
Hmm.
risk, because as it
Yes.
starts growing, people find it difficult to actually allocate resources. That is where
Yeah.
Sanjay's question also comes. You have other things like internal issues, and unrealistic expectations. These are all risks. But if you see studies associated with this, they point out that allocation of resources and the stoppage of resources often have become very detrimental to online learning communities. But I am sure that leadership with a vision generally considers all these aspects.
True. Ehsan has mentioned it will enable. What I lost it. It will enable aspects of one's personality you never knew. I mean, yes, in a way that's so
Yes,
true, is it not?
yes, yes,
Uh, it will open so many newer avenues which we never thought of.
yes. I agree with
Yes.
that. Yeah.
And if we attach faculty KPIs to example, connecting people as a competency of modern
Yeah,
HPE.
I was actually mentioning this, connecting people becomes a competence. But I don't know, we might take some time to see that this becomes KPIs. But thoughtful leaders, I still remember uh, my head of the department, long, it's more than 30 years, I would say, who never knew about distributed leadership or who never thought about these things, often used to consider these aspects during promotion. It is just not the papers that we publish. It is just not the patents that we got. He always used to inquire with fellow colleagues, how is this person, and not only
Yeah.
with the fellow teachers, with the technicians who worked in the department, and right from the boy who was the assistant. So he never knew that it was a 360-degree evaluation, or we never, yeah. But he had the wisdom those days, 30 years back, before a promotion or before giving somebody something that is very considered as prestigious as far as academic is concerned. So we could attach this, but implementation is a very, very tricky one, because Margaret, you and me will be blamed for many things that we were biased, so it has to be done with a lot of consideration.
Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So if anyone would like to have the last word, or would you like, then we will allow Shifa to have the last word. So over to you, Shifa.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to firstly, of course, thank Dr. Siraj for the wonderful presentation, and also Dr. Sucheta for such wonderful moderation. We're always so fortunate to have our faculty join us and to host you. And we really hope to have you again very, very soon, both of you back.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
And Dr.
Shifa. My
Siraj,
my apologies for having disconnected it between, because I'm sitting in a place where it's not that great as far as but I'm sure that you heard me,
Yeah.
and
Loud and
so
clear.
loud, and yeah,
no,
that's
and
more than enough. It's the
you've
voice that
definitely
has to be heard. Yeah.
Yes.
given us enough to think about, and definitely enough for the audience to want you to come back very soon. So
Yeah, thank you so much for this invitation, and Shifa and Dr. Zaidi and Sujeta for the moderation, and all the participants who have spent their valuable Saturday morning, afternoon, or evening, depending upon which part of the globe you are. Take care and stay safe, and it's very important these days, to see that we are together here for the next webinar.
yes, definitely.
Yes.
So what I'll do now is just very quickly before I have everyone, we end the webinar, I'll very quickly just share two announcements with our audience. So firstly, I'd like to just remind everyone of our next event coming up, and that will be in 2 weeks' time on Saturday, June 19th. At 11 a.m. GMT, same time, with Dr. Madalena Patricio, who was faculty we had also hosted at the e-Congress in April. So she will be speaking on best evidence medical education. So we're looking forward to that, followed by Professor Yadullah of the UK. And then very quickly, I'll also share with you a save the date. So we are hoping to have, I don't know if you're able to see that. There we go.
Yeah, we are. We can see
Perfect. So
it.
we're hosting Imamia Medics International, and Sadiq International University is continuing with its long-standing tradition of hosting CME conferences, this time in North America with international participation, we hope both virtually and in person. And this will be from the 29th to 31st October. We're being hosted by our chapter in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, at the Atlanta Evergreen Marriott Conference. So you all can see this Stone Mountain resort that we've booked. So we are looking forward to, some medical professional, medical education, parallel sessions with pharmaceutical, dental, and other healthcare fields, as well as a youth and women's wing as well. So again, please save the date. There will be international participation. We'll have all of it live streamed, and again with this CME accredited course sections as well. So I do encourage you all to keep on the lookout, and I'll continue to let you all know as things emerge as well. But again, thank you, Dr. Siraj, Dr. Sujeta, and have a great rest of your Saturday.
Thank you so much. Pleasure's all
Thank you so
mine.
much. Thank you.